In this video, we're looking at a ChannelPlus on-screen caller ID unit from the late 90s, a device that could overlay caller ID information from incoming calls to your landline phone right onto your TV. We'll take a look at how you can manually control it via its serial port, but then we'll configure some Cisco gear as a local telephone network, complete with caller ID config, and see if we can get our Homelab Caller ID working on a killer setup. Let's get into it. Today we're going to have a look at this ChannelPlus unit. It is specifically a model 6110 on-screen ID. This little guy takes a video coming in, so maybe like your VCR back in the day or something, and it will spit it back out for your TV, and it also takes a phone line coming in, and when someone gives you a call, it'll overlay the caller ID information, if there is any, onto your video screen. I guess the idea is you're watching a movie in your living room and you want to decide if it's worth getting up when someone's calling you. What had originally drawn me to this thing is this serial port. So I did a video eons ago where I got this thing up and running with the serial console, and you can actually manipulate what's on the screen via serial commands to it, which is pretty fascinating. And actually kind of weird if you think about it. Like, who was this for? Like a hobbyist? Like a prosumer that wants to mess with that with their home computer? This thing came out in the late 90s. This one in particular has a 1998 date stamp on it. And I don't really know who it was for. They must have had some sort of business application in mind, some sort of pro application. Otherwise, I don't think they would have bothered putting this serial port in here and making this thing as advanced as it is. I actually found out about this ChannelPlus brand from these things. These are video RF modulators. So I use these in what I call my Homelab cable setup. This particular unit can take two composite video sources in my case, a bunch of Raspberry Pis streaming TV shows, and through a series of button clicks, you can configure it to take that composite stream from the Raspberry Pis and turn it into television signals that you can tune to with a TV over coax. And this ChannelPlus company was doing all sorts of weird stuff. I've got this absolutely bizarre unit here, the 7300 series camera. This is a black and white camera that you would put in like an outlet, and I think it streams over composite. I think I see a BNC connector down in there. So I guess you'd like install this on the front of your house and stream it to your TV somehow, way before that became commonplace, obviously. I don't know how old this is, but just by the look of it and the heft and the electronics in there, 90s, I would think. So yeah, I'll have to try that out someday. Let me know if you'd be interested in that. I don't know if this thing works. But back to this little guy. When I first got this, the only way I could interact with it and do anything interesting with it was over the serial port, which was fun, and that was my use case at the time. I didn't have any actual phone equipment that I could test this out with, and certainly not an analog line. But things have changed since then. We're going to use this Cisco gear, along with some real phones, and a couple cards I'm going to show you, to produce basically a local telephone network. A real analog telephone network that I can plug into this guy. I'll theoretically be able to configure caller ID information for the phones calling in and ultimately dialing this thing, and we should be able to see it on the screen. But first, let's hook this thing up and just see if the serial port still works and this thing's functional, and we'll go from there. Let's get this thing hooked up. I've got an RCA cable. I use white for the video out, just like they did. I don't actually know if this thing will overlay onto a video out without a video coming in. I don't think I've tried it this way, so we'll see. I don't see why it wouldn't work, but we'll try it out. This button here lets you manually cycle through the caller ID numbers that it has in its storage. I think it can store the last 45. Hopefully we'll be adding some today. Let's get it powered on. Doesn't make any noise, of course, no fans or anything. I like to keep these old Dell monitors around. Well, one, I did a lot of work back in the day right out of college on these Dell monitors. Kind of reminds me of being young, but also they make excellent bench monitors. So I'm going to power this one back on. This thing has composite, believe it or not. VGA, DVI, S-Video, composite. So it makes a really good bench monitor, but these things are wearing out. Like, you should go start a Dell Enterprise monitor refurbish company, and I'll be one of your 3 loyal customers. So I'm going to press that button again, and I'm getting nothing on the screen. I think it does need a video input. So let's go find one. Scrounged up a Raspberry Pi here. I've got the PoE injector. Light turned on, lights are turning on. This thing has been configured to output over composite. Let that start up. Here's the Raspberry Pi desktop, and it looks like crap because this thing's kind of stretching out the composite video signal, but if I start pressing that black button, we can see the saved caller IDs from however many years ago in this thing, which is pretty awesome. And if I stop pressing the button for a moment and wait, about 5 seconds later, it turns off. To make things just a little clearer, I've got this EOG program, so on the Raspberry Pi, I can just set it to show a black screen, basically. So here's that same thing without any background noise. Pretty amazing. I think this is trying to say that on November 4th, this guy got like a ton of calls. End of log. Think about that. Imagine getting like 10 calls in one day. I've actually got this thing hooked up to a USB to serial port adapter on that Raspberry Pi. I've never been able to get this thing to work with PuTTY on my Windows machine for whatever reason. That serial device is TTY USB 0 on this Raspberry Pi Linux machine, and we can echo strings to it. So I'll echo hello, and you can see it shows up on the screen. I found the full version of the manual online, and there's basically special ASCII characters you can send it that will do things. And over the serial console, you have to send it in octal. So what's happening here is I'm using printf to send octal 30. And as you can see, that is the command for clearing the screen. My old video, I deep dove on this and was able to like get it blinking and different backgrounds and stuff. And that's kind of what I was getting at. Like, I don't really know who this is for other than like me personally, because yeah, obviously this thing is awesome, but got it set up. I know it's working. I hadn't turned it on in over a year. Well, let's figure out the phone lines. That stuff is all working great. Let's commence the telecom portion of our program. We're going to be using this Cisco 2600 series router. I highly recommend these if you want to just play around with networking, telephony in like a Homelab fashion, like me just dicking around down here. Very affordable, very flexible, as we'll see on the back with these modular cards. Highly recommend it. Around back, you can see I've already got a couple of these slots already fully populated with modems. These are a couple of WIC 1AM V2 modems. And basically, this is the modem piece of my Homelab dial-up infrastructure. I've got another Cisco router mainly acting as the telecom component. I'm actually able to locally dial up into this equipment and use the internet, which is pretty cool. But these two modem cards are not going to do what we want. We need to start messing around with one of these cards. And I actually want to save the configuration on this, so I'll show you how to do that first. We're going to steal that USB to serial cable I was just using and get this plugged in. These Cisco units usually use an RJ45 connector over serial. Then we need power, of course, and let me show you around. We'll let this baby fire up, and then I'll show you how to back up its configuration from a Homelab perspective anyway. And then we're going to factory reset it, get it configured from a hardware perspective and a software perspective for exactly what we need for this caller ID stuff. To do this, of course, it will be useful to be on the network so that we can actually back this thing up to a TFTP server. I have a Proxmox instance running in my modern Homelab, and one of its VMs happens to be called Worker 3. On Worker 3, there is a TFTP server, so you can see I've got a bunch of Cisco bins and probably what is a previous backup of that 2600. If you're not familiar with this stuff, it can be a little bit of a whirlwind, but I've got something called a retro rack. I'm kind of racking up this 20 plus year old gear, and I plan to actually set up a dedicated TFTP server and a bunch of other services for that rack. So if that's something you're interested in, I can make videos about that. Let me know. So here we're at the command prompt over the serial console for that 2600 I was just showing you, and we can say enable en. This gets us into admin mode, or privileged mode, I suppose. This isn't a Cisco video, but it is a collab retro video, so what would that be without Cisco stuff? I'm going to do a show run, and this spits out the configuration that the router is using. So you can see I've got a bunch of stuff in here around dialing up and that Homelab dial-up stuff I've got configured. As you're using the Cisco CLI, which is an absolute pleasure in my opinion once you get used to it. Just now I typed show run. Well, there's a bunch of shortcuts. So you can say SH is short for show, SH run, same thing. Instead of show version, which will tell you the software version running on the router and a little bit of its hardware configuration, you can do SH ver, show version, as we fly through this video, I'll say the full version out loud, but you might see me type like the short version, for lack of a better word. Back on that worker, its IP address is 192.168.82 on my local network. On the 2600, we can say show IP information interface brief. So you can see I'm using the shorter versions of all these. And it's going to spit out some stuff. That Ethernet cable you saw me plug in has been configured as 192.168.1200, so they should be on the same network. Let's see if we can ping the TFTP server. And we can. Perfect. Now what we're going to do is copy the configuration of this router. So if we say show run again, it's basically it is literally going to be all this text you're seeing, which configures the router. So if this router gets factory reset, I can load this file in and it'll be back in business and it'll have the configuration for my Homelab dial-up. We're going to copy the running config, which is the configuration file I was just showing you, to TFTP. We'll type in the IP address of my TFTP server on the same network. Need to give it a file name, so I'm going to go with 2600 back new, I guess. And now it has copied that configuration from the router over to my TFTP server. If we take a look at the contents of the file we just created via TFTP from this router, here it is. The full configuration, so I can do whatever I want on this router now and get it back into this configuration when I'm done. My old friend here has been helping me. This is Nikki. She's almost 14 years old. How old are you? We just got a new cat, and old Nikki here is not impressed. She does not like the new cat, even though the new cat is very nice. Nikki is not very nice. So she's down here helping me make some videos. Now, let's factory reset this bad boy. We're going to say erase startup config. And it's asking me if I really want to do that. I think we're done. So we're going to do a reload. Resetting the router with a factory default startup config. So a fresh config is going to be loaded into the router. And we'll be able to actually persist that to memory. This thing has some system bootstrap software from 1999, 25 years ago, almost 26. The router has reloaded and I should be able to enable without a password. I can. So we can do a show run again and you'll see it's pretty minimal. I'm actually kind of confused that it has an IP address. Where would it get that from if I just erased the config? Anyway, always something new to learn. WR for write config. This thing is clearly trying to like do other stuff. 192.168.1.62. That really feels like something I would have done. At any rate, I like to do a show IP interface brief that shows me all the interface names. I care about this one Ethernet interface 00. So I'll do a conf t and I will configure that interface. I'm going to give it an IP address. This will be the same IP address this thing already had, just for simplicity. No shut is short for no shutdown, meaning the interface is up and active. Well, let's write that out. All right, show IP in brief. This is going to be your favorite command if you're doing this stuff. It's up and up, meaning there's a cable plugged in and it's up. It thinks everything's fine. Let's ping that TFTP server just for fun and we're good. Reload. Okay, that mess about TFTP auto-loading a config from 255, etc. Here's how you solve that. You go enable conf t no service config. I had never encountered that before. This is not a generic Cisco video. We're done with this. Let's set this thing up specifically as a telecom provider with caller ID so we can check that thing out. Before we get further, let's talk about the two different types of voice cards you're gonna have to worry about and what I've been messing around with for the past 3 hours. If you're gonna start messing around with this analog telephone stuff, it can be a little confusing and I'm still confused, so I'll explain it the best way I can. For our purposes, there are two types of phone ports, something called FXS or foreign exchange station, and something called FXO, foreign exchange office. This card I've been showing is an FXS card. The two just means there's two ports. And this other example I've got here is an FXO card. It's got 4 ports, that's what the 4 stands for. The important thing is that you're almost always, I think, gonna want FXS cards. These provide dial tone to the phone as a visual example, this can be thought of as the telecom provider, like the jack coming to your house on the wall, providing you with phone service. And you then plug your telephones into it, and they'll get dial tone from an FXS port. FXO can just be thought of as like another phone. You can call these things. It can receive calls. So you could have this in another router that this thing's calling for whatever reason. I've never actually had a use case for that down here, though I do have a couple of these cards. The important thing to note is if you're going to generate dial tone and you want to plug phones into this stuff, you need an FXS port. Speaking of this FXS voice card I was going to throw in this 2600 that we just prepped, I can't get it to work in this thing. When you're dealing with these different cards and modules, you worry about a matrix of issues. The physical form factor, there's different iterations of these cards, the router you're running it on, and the iOS version, the software version that's on the router. I do not have the right combination of all of those things to make this card work in here. It should theoretically work just fine in this 2600. In the documentation, it says this card works with all iOS versions as long as they have the Plus feature set. The iOS version I had on here when we were resetting did not have that. I found one that did and got that on there. And in the interim, I put an iOS version that was too large for this on there and it couldn't boot, so I had to do some disaster recovery. Long story short, I can't find the right iOS version that is going to allow this card to work. So we're just going to go all in on this thing. This is a Cisco 2900. It's got 8 FXS ports installed, and it's already been pre-configured for my dial-up purposes. I can dial one of the ports with a phone, and it'll call the other one. Here's what the front of that 2900 series looks like, by the way. It's obviously a newer series than this 2600 we were messing around with. I'll show you some of the relevant configuration I already have on this thing for my dial-up stuff. So I've got some of these dial peer configurations set up here. And basically what it's saying is, when someone dials this number, 425-271-5555, on any incoming port, dial this port that you're seeing on the screen here. And I've got another one set up where it says, if anyone dials this number, ring this port. So we'll be using this top rule here so that when I dial the 5555 number, it's going to ring that second port. So I've got this phone here. Whenever I dial that number I was just showing you, it's going to ring this port. This is port 0, 1, 2, 3. This is port 1 that's been configured to ring. So I'm going to dial our number here, 425-271-5555. We hear the ring. We can have a conversation. I haven't configured any caller ID stuff. I don't actually even know if it's going to work yet. But let's get our caller ID box in the mix. So the phone is now going to go here. Remember, this is the phone we are dialing. And the line, as if it was coming, you know, from the wall in your house, is going to go into this line portion. So I'm expecting it to either do nothing or show like that a call is coming in and it doesn't have any caller ID information. So I'm dialing the number now and you'll hear it ring. And I don't see anything on the screen. Just to make sure this thing's still working. Yep, I can still press the button. Okay, let's see if we can configure some caller ID info. The moment of truth. So let's configure from terminal. We're going to configure voice port 010. That is the port on the router that the phone we're calling from is plugged into, because we want to deliver caller ID from the caller, obviously. First thing we do is caller ID enable. Okay. And then there's this station ID stuff where you can set the actual metadata about the caller. So I can give it a number that it's going to show as calling from. Let's do one slightly different than the others. And then of course a name. I will be Collab Retro. And I think that's it. I'm going to go look at my configuration real quick. There's the raw configuration for everything we just put in. I'm kind of nervous because the thing didn't show anything at all when the call went through, but maybe it just doesn't show anything when there's no caller ID information. Let's find out. Double checking this thing again. I'm paranoid. The screen goes black, of course, when it just sits here, so I want to make sure it still works. I am dialing the number. Nothing. That's not good. I figured it out. So we go to voice port 011. This is the voice port we are calling, the phone that is ringing and plugged into the caller ID thing. And of course, we need to enable caller ID on this port as well. There's probably some global setting. Okay, looking at the screen. I'm going to click redial. It's ringing. And there it is, the number I'm calling from, the name I gave it. Awesome. If I pick up, it just stays there for a while. I have an active call right now. Yeah, and it just delays out like that. I'm going to press that button, and there it is. It's actually not that far off. It's like a day off. Wow, this is so cool. I don't think this Raspberry Pi is giving us the realistic experience that the kind of guy that would have owned one of these would have been having in 1998. That's right. That's a Laserdisc player. Picture this. It's 1998. You just got home from work at Enron or wherever people worked back then. You just cracked a beer, you're relaxing on the couch, phone's way over in the kitchen, and you're ready to watch the pilot episode of Star Trek Next Generation on Laserdisc because you own that for some reason. You're a big hotshot Enron executive. Gotta love that font. Laserdisc. I've never tried this disc. Let's see if it works. Best part about Laserdisc is you can kind of jog to very exact locations. Look how like fast I can move it back and forth. Anyway, whoa, there it is. You're just getting into it, and your stupid buddy calls. But you know, it's just this dumb guy, and you don't have to go pick up the phone. Well, there you have it. I'm not gonna lie, I was getting kind of nervous that I wasn't gonna be able to get this convoluted pile of stuff to work, but works great. When I picked this thing up, I would have never imagined I'd be running real caller ID data through it via a bunch of Cisco gear that I also probably didn't own when I picked it up. Really glad I was able to get it working. It's a super interesting device just for the caller ID on the screen alone, but the little bit of the serial dabbling I was doing in this video and deep dive in the other one, I'll link to that in the description. Pretty impressive little gadget in 1998. Someone was impressing their friends. They always say you can spoof caller ID, and as you saw, I just like typed in some stuff and it worked. I think you could probably intercept on a line or have your own gear that you're calling out from. I think what it does is it puts like some data between the rings, like, you know, like modem style data, and a little device on the other end between rings is able to demodulate it and understand it, something like that. It's funny, I started thinking about this video a few weeks ago, and then Cathode Ray Dude and just a bunch of other telephony stuff is showing up on YouTube. It's like something's in the water. It's funny how like-minded YouTubers sort of organically morph towards one topic or the other, and let me tell you, December's all about telephones, apparently. But I hope you enjoyed this. Sorry about the clunky Cisco walkthrough. I really love playing with routers, as you can tell in the videos, and so I kind of get carried away and start messing around, and then I gotta pull myself back to the topic at hand. But if you like this type of stuff, I've got way more on the way. Tons of ideas, tons of gear piling up that I need to do videos on, and I will do videos on. So if you'd like to support the channel, please consider subscribing. I am running out of time to get to 50,000 by the end of this year. But beyond that, I'm of course on Patreon. I post behind the scenes type videos, and you can see what I'm tinkering with, what I'm thinking about, and that sort of thing. But in the meantime, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.